Okay, I think we're all ready to go. So now I'll just start with my talk. Hi, everyone. I'm Wim De Neys from the University of Paris, reasoning and decision-making researcher. And I'm going to talk about debiasing. I'm going to talk about debiasing, so how to get people to reason better, more accurately, from a dual process perspective. And I'll try to show you why this perspective, why this type of research has actually interesting theoretical implications for the dual process framework, and the other way around, why this dual process framework actually has some very interesting and applied implications for people who want to look at debiasing and want to try to improve people's decision making. Okay. Yeah, it's just a general outline, but I'm going to walk you through it. So stay with me. So if I'm going to talk about debiasing, of course, I have to also mention biased thinking, right? And I'm going to start with one of my favorite examples of biased thinking in daily life. As you presumably know, the most popular hamburger in the US is McDonald's Quarter Pounder, right? It's called a Quarter Pounder because you actually get a quarter of a pound of meat, but not too hard. At a certain point, one of the main competitors of McDonald's in the States, A&W, wanted to get to that top selling spot, and they introduced a new hamburger called the third of a pounder. They call it a third of a pounder because you got a third of a pound of meat, and they sold it for the exact same price. And they did some prior testing showing that actually people preferred the taste of A&W's third of a pounder. So it should be a done deal, right? You sold it at the exact same price, so you get more meat for the exact same price. So it's cheaper, and people actually prefer the taste of the new hamburger. Turned out that this was a big disaster. People did not buy the new A&W third of a pounder. And why not? Afterwards, they did some testing, and it turned out that people actually figured that they got less meat with the third of a pounder. Why? Because, of course, we're talking about fractions here. But intuitively, people focused on the absolute number that's mentioned in the name of the hamburger. So yes, at an absolute level, 4 is more than 3, true. But in this case, we're talking about fractions. So you should look at the denominator. And as you all know, like if you cut your pie in more pieces, well, then every piece gets smaller and smaller, right? So it's the exact opposite of what you should do when you're focusing on the absolute numbers. You might say, well, it's just like stupid Americans. That's what people back home in Europe would say, presumably here in Canada sometimes too. But unfortunately, that's not what's the problem here. And just to illustrate that, you can just think back a couple of years ago during the pandemic. At a certain point in most Western countries, the vast majority of the population was actually already vaccinated. But still, if you went to the hospitals, you could see that at a certain point, there were more people who were actually vaccinated who were in the ICU units than people who were not vaccinated. Now, some people drew the conclusion from that information that, whoa, this vaccine is really dangerous. Right? They have to stop using it because there's more people at the hospitals that are actually vaccinated than not vaccinated. The problem, of course, is that at that point, the vast majority of the population was already vaccinated. So you have to, there too, look at the denominator. You have to take the base rate of the whole group into account. If you do that, it's pretty clear that the vaccine was super efficient, right? So why do people fail at this? Because they neglect base rate information, right? Doing fractions, taking the denominator into account. If you're in a more intuitive reasoning mode, it's something that's hard to do for most people, right? Okay. So in the reasoning and decision-making field, we've developed all these classic tasks that allow us to study this type of bias, right? And I'm going to show you one problem, and it's the one problem I'm going to be using in all the experiments that I'm going to show you. So Kahneman and Tversky's base rate neglect problem. It's very simple. You get some information about the composition of a sample. You're being told, okay, we've got this group of 1,000 participants, 995 Democrats, 5 Republicans in this case, right? A psychologist made personality descriptions of everyone in this sample. We put these in a big box, then drew one description randomly from the box, and I'm going to show you that description, right? get a description. In this case, this guy, Russell, he's 67, lives in Georgia. He used to work in the oil business. He owns a ranch and he believes in traditional marriage. Simple question, what is most likely? Is this person, Russell, is he going to be a Democrat or a Republican? Right? Okay. Now, what most people are, majority of the typical sample will say that in this case, that response B is most likely, that this person is going to be a Republican. Why? Because people are focusing on the description. The description is designed such that it's going to cue a very strong, stereotypical, intuitive response. The description makes you think of a Republican, right? 67, a bit older person, lives in Georgia, southern states, oil business, ranch, traditional marriage is something that we tend to associate with Republicans and less so with Democrats. Now, if the problem is that's all that was being mentioned just based on the description, then it might indeed be more likely that this person is going to be a Republican, right? There might be more Republicans who fit the description than Democrats. The problem here was that the problem information also mentioned that there were far more Democrats than Republicans. So if you look at the base rates, right, if there's a sample where there's 995 Democrats and only 5 Republicans, 200 times more Democrats and Republicans. If you draw randomly from that sample, of course, it's going to be far more likely that you will end up with a Democrat, right? Especially because they're all, even in Georgia, even among senior citizens who are 67, there are also Democrats who live in Georgia, who work in the oil business and own a ranch, right? So if you combine the information value in the description and in the base rates, right, that should value to the response that this person is most likely a Democrat. But we know that often people are not doing that because intuitively they tend to base their decision on the stereotype, on the intuitive response that's being cued by a problem. So bias. Okay. Now, if I were to summarize half a century of reasoning and decision-making research, I could tell you that one of the main conclusions is that people often fail to reason correctly, logically, right? On many reasoning tasks, many educated participants actually fail to give the correct response. Why? Because people are typically biased by their intuitions. That's the general explanation, right? We tend to rely on stereotypical beliefs, intuitive feelings when we're making decisions, and we're not always engaging in more deliberate, reflective, logical thinking. Okay. Dual process theory. Well, this very influential framework was just introduced to make sense of this bias phenomenon, right? And the basic idea, as Lyndon already showed you, is that people simply do not have one system or one process they can use to arrive at a conclusion, but they have two, all right? And nowadays, they're typically being referred to as system 1 and system 2. System 1 being a more intuitive system, system 2, the more deliberate analytic system. System 1, very fast, automatic, doesn't burden your cognitive resources. System 2, a lot slower and requiring cognitive resources to function efficiently. Okay, very simple idea. And it's important to underline that from the start, like everyone in the fields, right, agreed that the intuitive system is very useful in and by itself. Why? Because it's cognitively cheap. It's not burdening your cognitive capacity, and it allows you to make decisions really fast. And that's very important in daily life to be able to do that. Classic example is like, imagine that you're a caveman walking around in the bushes. All of a sudden, there's a saber-toothed tiger that jumps on the track right in front of you. What are you going to do at that point? Well, what you're not going to do is you're not going to sit down and say, well, wait a minute, I'm just going to think it through and then, come up with a response and then react. No, you're going to use your system 1 and make a decision very fastly. You're either going to fight or flight. Okay, so it's very important to have such a system. Everyone agrees. And that's the reason, presumably, why we have it, because it's evolutionarily useful. The problem is just that sometimes these two systems might cue conflicting responses, right? And in that case, and that's what's happening in these classic bias examples that I just showed you. And in that case, system 2, the more demanding system, will need to override and block your intuitive system one. And the problem there is that we human beings, we're cognitive misers. We do not like to do things that are hard. Often we're just lazy. So as soon as the system one, the intuitive system, is cueing a response, often we're just going to stick to it. And we're not going to engage in that more demanding system two type of thinking. And as a result, often we're not going to notice that actually we're being biased and our intuitive response conflicts with these more logical, analytical system two considerations. Okay? So a very simple story. I mean, takes you a minute to explain this to people. And the whole framework is super popular nowadays. I think it's really hard to overestimate the popularity of the dual process framework nowadays in the cognitive sciences, but beyond, like philosophy, economics. Why? Well, the basic reason is it's a very simple, appealing story that resonates with some of these classic distinctions we know from the arts, literature, conflict between the heart and the mind, for example. Plato already talked about it. So as it's been mentioned in one of the questions already, in 2002, one of the big names in the field, Daniel Kahneman, was awarded with the Nobel Prize, wrote a best-selling book about it, this work, to introduce the dual process framework, Thinking Fast and Slow, sold millions and millions of copies. The framework is also being applied in a lot of different fields. These applications became very influential in their own right. And I just checked it like a couple of months ago for a talk I was giving. If you enter dual process theory on Google Scholar, you get almost 5 million hits. If you look at like another psychological term, such as depression, for example, it's 3 million. So it's actually more popular than depression research. Okay, so very, very, very influential and yeah, important. But as Lyndon also already mentioned, the framework from the start has also been criticized. And I think that the main critique is that, yeah, I mean, the framework is giving you a very nice, appealing story, but the processing specifications haven't been specified, right? It's not really clear how these two systems are working and interacting. And there's a lot of untested assumptions, okay? So I think like some 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people started realizing this, and there has been since then a lot of research testing these basic core assumptions of the theory. And that's something that I've been doing in my work, and that's what I'm going to quickly walk you through, right? So we're testing basic assumptions of the dual process framework, and I'm going to focus on two key assumptions, the bias blind spot and the corrective assumption, right? Just going to walk you through it one by one. You'll see what I mean by them. So dual process revisions, research trying to test the basic assumptions of the framework. And what I'll show you is that these suggest that we need to revise some of the key assumptions. Okay. So what is the bias blind spot assumption? It's basically an assumption made by the traditional dual process framework about the nature of biased reasoning, right? And if you look at the work of Kahneman, Pete Stanovich, Jonathan Evans, their basic idea was that, okay, like in these classic reasoning tasks, what is going on? Why are people biased? Well, your system one, your intuitive system, is generating this response, right? That is conflicting with some logical normative considerations. The idea is that if you want to do logic, if you want to take these logical considerations into account, for example, the fact that you have to focus on the base rate information, right? You have to take the denominator into account. Well, then you need system two. But system two is demanding, right? It takes a lot of, it's slow, it takes a lot of processing effort. So as soon as system one is suggesting a response, we're cognitive misers, then we're going to tend to stick to that intuitive response, and we're not going to engage the more demanding process. Therefore, we're not going to detect that there's actually a problem, that this intuitive response is actually violating some normative logical principles. So you're biased because you do not realize that you're being biased. And in by itself, that is not an unreasonable assumption, but you have to test it, of course, right? And when the theory was introduced, like that testing was not being done. So how can you test this? Well, basically, what you do is like in studies, all the studies I'm going to show you that I'll be referring to, we're presenting people classic reasoning problems, such as the base rate neglect problem that I just showed you, but you can also look at conjunction fallacy, syllogisms. What is key here that in the experiments, we're always presenting two types of problems. Classic conflict problems, the ones that I just showed you, where the intuitive response is being cued with conflict with some, with the correct response, with some logical principle, right? But we're also presenting control, no conflict problems, in which the intuitive response does not conflict with the correct response, with the logical response, okay? How do you do this? Well, pretty easy. You're just going to introduce some content transformation to get rid of the conflict. For example, here with the, it's not working. Yeah, here. On top, you have a classic conflict version, the problem that I just showed you, in which the base rates and the description are queuing a conflicting response. All right. Here at the bottom, if I walk away, is that hard for people online? Should I just stay here? Yeah, okay. On the bottom, you have a control no conflict problem where there's no conflict. How do we do this? We're just going to switch the base rates. We're just going to reverse the base rate information. So in this case, it's the exact same problem, but you're telling people there's 5 Democrats and 995 Republicans. So now both the base rate information and the description are doing the exact same response. There's no conflict. Okay. And what we're going to test is whether or not people process these two versions differently. That's the key question, right? If you're not in the classic, conflict problem, if you're not detecting the conflict, right? If you're just focusing on the stereotype that's being cued and you're neglecting the base rate information, right? Then the fact that we switch the base rates around should not impact your cognitive processing problem, right? If you're neglecting the base rate information, all that you're doing is focusing on the system 1 intuition that's being cued, so the description, right? And the fact that we switch the base rates around shouldn't impact the way that you're processing the different versions, right? And that's precisely what we're going to test. For example, we're going to look at latencies. How long do people take to actually solve these problems? If it's the case that people, when they're solving the conflict version and they're giving the incorrect response, if they're picking up on the conflict, if they realize, hey, wait a second, like, you know, when I'm reading this description, I think this guy's a Republican, but did they just tell me that there were more Democrats in the sample? Right? If you're noticing, if you're processing the base rate information, you're noticing the conflict, that should impact your cognitive processing. That you should be in doubt. It should take a little bit longer to solve the problem because you're in doubt, right? You should be a little less confident that actually the answer that you're giving is correct than in case when there's no doubt, right? So in the studies that I'm going to show you that I'm already referring to, that's what we're doing. Using different processing measures that allow us to see whether or not people process these two versions differently. And that allows us to draw some conclusions about whether or not people are sensitive to the conflict, the intrinsic conflict that's present in the problem. Okay. Okay, so different processing measures, right? And to cut a long story short, what we're finding is exactly that people show this conflict sensitivity. When biased reasoners, so people are giving an incorrect response, when they solve these conflict problems, we see that they take longer to give a response than when they're processing, when they're solving the no conflict problem, right? They're also a little bit less confident, and they also make eye movements back towards the logically critical problem information. So you can use eye tracking, for example. What you see is that when people are reading these problems, they start by reading the base rate information, the first part of the problem. Then people start reading the description. And as soon as they start reading the description and the conflict versions, people start making eye movements back towards the base rate information. So showing you that they are processing the base rate information. And they're not doing this when they're solving the no conflict problems, right? So the eye movements are suggesting that people are sensitive to the presence of conflict. You can also use fMRI or EEG, look at brain activation, for example, focusing on the anterior cingulate cortex, one of the regions that we know that's typically activated when people are in doubt, when they're being conflicted. You can see that this very same region is activated when people are solving these conflict problems, even when they're given the incorrect response. Okay. So all of these using different methods, you can do this with different tasks. I'm focusing on the base rate neglect task because it's an easy one to explain. Also, different teams have been finding the same conclusion that often this conflict detection process seems to be efficient, successful. So biased reasoners are not biased because they're not detecting that they're being biased. There is a sensitivity to the presence of conflict. Okay. And that's important because that suggests that the classic model is not correct. On top of that, research is not only showing that the bias detection or the conflict detection is successful, we also have evidence showing that it's actually automatic, right? And how do you test this? Well, we know that we're trying to figure out whether this conflict detection results from system 1 processing or system 2 processing. We know by definition, system 2 processing needs two things. It needs cognitive resources and it's slow, so it needs time. So now in the experiments that we're running, we're not going to give people those resources. Like we're forcing people to give a response very quickly. If we know that typically people will need, like, let's say 30 seconds to give you a solution to a problem, now we're going to give them 5 seconds, just the time that they need to read the problem, right? On top of that, we can actually use load designs in which we'll burden their cognitive resources with a secondary task. For example, before we show the reasoning problem, we just give them a series of digits or letters that they have to memorize, right? You could show them B, Y, W, Z, for example, and they have to memorize those letters while they're solving the reasoning problems, right? Because they have to do this memorization task, their cognitive system is going to be burdened. There will be less resources available actually for system 2. So if this conflict detection results from system 2 processing, it should be less efficient under dual task conditions and when people are time pressured, right? So what we're finding in the studies is that it has no impact whatsoever on the conflict detection process. So even when you experimentally knock out system 2, when people are forced to rely only on intuitive system 1 processing, they still show this conflict sensitivity. All right. So that's key evidence for what I'm referring to as this dual process model 2.0. It seems to suggest that we need to upgrade system 1, like processing logical information, such as the fact that you have to take base rate information into account, does not necessarily require activating system 2. You can do this when you're in a purely intuitive processing mode, right? Suggesting that in addition to these classic heuristic intuitions, for example, based on the stereotype that's being cued in a problem, people also have what I'm referring to as logical intuition. So they're showing some intuitive sensitivity to the importance of logical principles, such as the role of base rate information in a base rate neglect problem. Okay. So bias sensitivity, there's no bias blind spot. Fine. Okay, so that's one assumption that we're testing, or we tested, and where the classic assumptions are not being met. Now I'm going to focus on a second assumption that you can test, the corrective assumption. The bias blind spot assumption was an assumption about the nature of incorrect responding. The corrective assumption is an assumption about the nature of correct responses. There, the classic idea is that, well, if you're solving these classic reasoning problems, right, where your intuitive system is queuing an incorrect response, generating a correct response will require activation of system 2. You have to block that initial intuitive response that's popping up in mind. For example, with the bat and ball problem. Does everyone know the bat and ball problem over here? I always assume by now that's the case, but in case if you're the one person that actually doesn't know it, you can see it over there. It's one of these classic problems where intuitively an incorrect response is being queued. You feel like, well, the correct response is going to be 10 cents, but the correct response is actually 5 cents. If you think it through, it's clear that at $1 more, the bat has to cost $1.05. So the ball will cost 5 cents. Okay, it's one of these classic examples. The idea is that what's going to happen in this problem, initially, this incorrect 10 cents response will pop up. People will give the correct response, will afterwards need to activate their system 2, complete system 2 computations, and that will allow them to see, hey, wait a second, it can be 10 cents. Actually, it's 5 cents. Okay. So if you look at a timeline of the reasoning process, the traditional assumption is that initially, first, the quick incorrect intuitive response will be generated, and then in a later stage, because system 2 is slower, needs more time to complete its operations, then the 5 cents, correct 5 cents response will be generated. Again, that does not sound unreasonable. Like if I'm solving the bat and ball problem, for example, I have a very strong feeling, introspective feeling that the first thing that I'm doing is thinking about 10-cent response. And then if I think it through, I might arrive at a 5 cents response. Okay. But of course, introspection is not hard data, so you have to test it. So how can you actually test this? Well, you can use a paradigm design introduced by Valerie Thompson, the two-response paradigm. And it's very easy. You're going to present people classic reasoning problems, and you're not simply asking them to generate a response, but you're going to ask them to generate two consecutive responses. Yeah.
Bias effect too. Is it possible to bypass intuition processing completely and this non-reflective right away?
That is also could be like one possibility, that you're not generating the intuitive response. And I think like the classics like the big three, Kahneman, Evans, Stanovich, they would be okay with it. That's maybe some people would only activate system 2. But in that case, the idea would still be like, if you're going to generate the correct response, you'll at least have to activate your system 2 and think it through. Maybe you didn't generate the incorrect response at the first stage. So that would still be okay, I think, with a classic view. Right? So how are we going to test this? So we're going to ask people to generate two consecutive responses. The first response, they have to generate it as quickly as possible. They have to respond with the first thing that pops up in mind. And then afterwards, people know, well, now they can take all the time to actually think it through, reflect, deliberate, and then give a final answer. The classic prediction is that, yeah, if you get like, some people might actually solve the problem correctly, but then that should only happen in the second stage of the two-response paradigm. The initial stage, where people are in this more intuitive reasoning mode, you shouldn't see correct responses. Okay? Of course, then you have to be sure that people are not cheating, because you could have like a subject actually already thought it through, reasoned about the problem, reflected on it, and then tells you, okay, no, this answer like 5 cents, yeah, just generated intuitively. Didn't even have to think about it. My first hunch was it was 5 cents. So we have to know that people are not cheating. How do we do that? Well, again, we're going to use this experimental procedure to knock out system 2 during the reasoning process. Right? We're going to force people to generate that first response under strict time pressure. So only the time they need to actually read the problem. And we're going to use this dual task load procedure, where you have to memorize something while they're solving the problem for the first time, just to be sure that this system 2 cannot be efficiently activated. Okay, and I'm going to show you what a trial then actually looks like, because it might be a bit confusing. So we're starting the problem with just a fixation cross. Then we're introducing the load task. In this case, people have to memorize the location of the crosses within the matrix. Right, it's a task that's been shown to burden your executive resources, so it's demanding. Then we show the problem, right? Initial response stage. People have to give their very first intuitive answer as fast as possible. They get 5 seconds to do this. We know that typically, if people solve this problem correctly, they need about like 30 seconds. 5 seconds is the time that you need to read the problem, move the mouse, and click on a response, right? So it's very fast. On top of that, you're memorizing the grid pattern, right? So it's super demanding. Whatever it is that you're doing, it is not deep reflection. Okay. So first response, then we check whether people actually memorized the correct pattern. Like if they didn't, then we're not analyzing the trial, because then we're not sure that they're not cheating. And then second, final response stage. Now people get all the time they want to reason it through. There's no longer load. There's no time pressure. Now you can actually do the hard reasoning. Okay. So that's it. That's the paradigm. Of course, like this bat and ball problem, it's very well known. So in the studies, we're checking whether or not people already know the problem. If you already know the problem, it's not hard to generate a correct response intuitively. But we're also modifying the content, so we wouldn't be using this version. But for example, we would use a version saying a magazine and a banana cost $3.30 in total. The banana costs so much. So the content is being modified. So it's the same structure, but different content. So if you simply have seen the problem before, that should not allow you to solve the problem. Okay. And I'm going to show you the results of some dozen studies with different reading problems, but I'm just putting them all together when I'm presenting the results. Okay, so what do we get? Like, yeah, over here, like, these are just like referring to different types of problems, bat and ball, base rate neglect, syllogisms. You could just look at the mean over here. What you get, like, if we're looking at a final response stage, is that, yes, correct responses are still rare. Like, the majority of trials, the majority of people are not giving the correct response. That's important to notice, right? Second thing that you notice is that if you go from initial to final response stage, like, accuracy increases. So there's a little bump in accuracy, consistent with the traditional framework, right? So if people have the time to reason it through in a final response stage, like, they're doing a better job. And it's important to stress that, okay? So the correction phenomenon, it's real. Every single study that we ever run, like, we find this pattern, okay? But what is key here is that, just look at this, right? The vast majority of these correct responses are already being observed in the initial response stage. Right? There's like almost like 4 out of 5 correct responses that we're seeing, and in that case, people already generated a correct response in the initial response stage. So they didn't need to activate their system 2 to correct their initial response. No, their initial response was already being correct. Okay. And that's again something that's not consistent with the traditional framework, right? Again, seems to suggest that we need to upgrade our view of system 1, processing logical information, taking base rates into account, for example, does not necessarily require activating system 2. People can already do this when they're in the more intuitive system 1 reasoning mode. Okay. Yeah, I'll just go back, right? Okay. All right. Now it's important when I'm saying this, so you might know, well, okay, like, if people have these logical intuitions, right? Fine. But then why are they not giving the correct response? It's important that this new idea comes with like new predictions, new assumptions. The idea is that we have not all intuitions are being created equal, right? There can be strength differences, and it's the difference in strength between different types of intuitions that will actually determine performance, right? So the pattern that we see for most people is something like this, where yes, they have a logical intuition, but they also have a heuristic intuition, for example, based on the stereotype in the base rate neglect problem, right? And typically that heuristic intuition, that stereotype-based intuition, will be a lot stronger. So there is some logical information that's intuitively being activated, allows people to show this conflict sensitivity, to detect that there's that this response is not fully warranted, right? But in the end, like, people will still give the heuristic response because it's the activation level is it's a lot stronger. Okay. And then for some people, we see the reverse pattern. We actually have a much stronger logical intuition than a heuristic intuition. And it's those people who will actually manage to generate the correct response intuitively, right? And then for some people, we see like a mixed pattern where the strength of the two intuitions is about the same, right? Heuristic intuition might be a bit stronger. So if you force them to respond intuitively, they'll give an incorrect response. And if you give them the time to think it through, they can actually override that incorrect intuition because it's not as strongly activated in the case of the biased reasoners. Okay? So that's the idea, new predictions. It's not that important, but that's just the general, general idea behind the framework. So what I've showed you is that, okay, classic dual process framework, we're testing the basic assumptions, right? And what we're seeing is that these corrections, these assumptions need to be revised. And that's why in the field, like people such as myself, we came up with this new idea, this new model, right? And I think it's a better model than the classic models, right? And that's not a bold statement because it's not surprising that's a better model because it's totally post hoc, right? This model was built explicitly to account for the data that we were observing, right? So it's built after the fact. And that's why it's doing a better job. That's important because one of the classic critiques on dual process theory is that, well, it's not falsifiable. You cannot test it. Well, you can test it. It is generating predictions, right? It's true that at the time when the framework was introduced in the 60s, not all assumptions were being tested, but you can test these assumptions. That's what we did here, right? the assumptions do not turn out to be correct, then what we're doing is we're building a new model with some revised assumptions, right? And of course, like, right now, this model, I would say, is doing a better job, but in the future, this model will also definitely will need to be revised, right? So it's nothing that's what basic science is about, right? You have a model, make some predictions. If the predictions turn out not to be correct, then you revise your model, and as time goes by, hopefully your model becomes better and better. So that's what's going on right now in the field, okay, at theoretical level. Fine. But I promised you I was going to talk actually about debiasing. Right? Why is debiasing important? Well, if you have a field showing that people show this massive bias, most people are not giving correct responses. Of course, cognitive scientists have been interested in debiasing, trying to get rid of this bias for a really long time. And recently, the last 5 years or so, there have been some interesting findings showing that very short, like plain English explanations of the bias, where you're simply explaining people why the incorrect response that they're typically generating is not correct and what the correct response should be, is actually having a big impact on their performance, right? There's work in Paris, for example, Hugo Mercier's team, but also by Kerry Morwich, Boston University, showing that, for example, what Hugo did, like he had people sit together in a group and discuss, for example, the bat and ball problem. And what he found was that as soon as there was one participant in a group who actually solved the problem correctly, then the correct response spread like very rapidly through the group. So as soon as you tell people, well, it can be 10 cents because at 10 cents, then at $1 more, the bat would cost 110. And at like then 10 cents for the ball, the total would be 120. That's too much, right? Because the problem stated that in total, the price would be 110. So that's why with 5 cents is actually work is to have 5 cents, and then you add the bat cost $1.05 at 5 cents more, you get to a total of 110. Something like that, right? If you do that, you can actually show that people become very accurate at solving these problems, right? So afterwards, when people are being retested, you test them with the same problem, but of course, a different content. So it's not that they're simply memorized, the correct response is 5 cents. No, the content is being modified. So they actually have to do some real thinking. We used this procedure that was introduced by Mercier and Morwich in our studies. And I'm just going to show you, give you a quick example of what what people are seeing in the bias intervention. Okay. It takes like 2 minutes.
Let's look at the problem you just answered. The question was, a magazine and a banana cost $2.60 in total. The magazine cost $2 more than the banana. How much does the banana cost? The correct response is 30 cents. Many people are tempted to answer 60 cents, but this is wrong. If the banana costs 60 cents, the magazine would cost $2.60 as it costs $2 more than the banana. Both together, they would then cost $3.20. However, the problem said that they cost $2.60 together. The correct answer is that the banana cost 30 cents and the magazine cost $2.30. So together, they cost $2.60.
That's it. You can do this for different types of classic reasoning problems. So same structure. What you're doing is you're showing people what the correct response should be. You're telling them that the typical intuitive response that most people are giving is not correct. And now you're telling them what the correct response should be. Not using any complex maths, not diagrams. Very basic, very simple. That's it. Okay. This is based on how one subject who actually solved the problem correctly explained it to other people in the group. That's the basic idea behind the interventions. Okay. Okay, but now debiasing and dual processes. Why? Well, the classic idea when Hugo, so Mercier and Morwich, when they found these debiasing, these very nice debiasing results, their idea was that the intervention is actually impacting the system 2 level. So the idea is that, well, yeah, typically people are biased because they're not taking it through. Once you show them the intervention, then they'll activate their system 2. They'll think it through, spend more time trying to solve the problem. and they'll get it right. And that's why it's working, because you're boosting system 2. Right? Better deliberation. That's why it's working. Okay, that's based on the traditional view. And in theory, that might be right. But based on these revisions that I've been showing you on dual process theory, we're finding that system 1 is more effective than traditionally assumed. There's also an alternative possibility. So maybe what you're seeing is, maybe that what's happening is that system 1 is being boosted. So I told you that we're finding that people at least have this very tiny logical intuition. Yes, the heuristic intuition might be a lot more, might be dominant, might be more strongly activated. But maybe what's happening with these interventions is that once you explain to people what they're doing, that's going to boost the activation of that correct logical intuition. And if that is the case, then what you should see that actually that after the intervention, people might actually, just as spontaneous correct reasoners often do, generate the correct solution already at the intuitive level, bypassing their system 2. That has interesting theoretical implications, because it's one way that to actually validate or test this new dual process theory 2.0, but it also has important applied implication, because if all that's we're doing with our interventions is boosting system 2, that's fine. The fact that we can debias people and get them to reason better, that's really good. But in a lot of daily life situations, often those types of interventions are going to be suboptimal. Why? Because in daily life, often we don't have the time to think it through, right? If you're a police officer and you have to make a decision to shoot, so you're pulling over a suspect and you see that the suspect is just reaching for their pocket, are they going to pull a gun? What's going on there? You have to make a decision very quickly, either to shoot, and if you're going to wait and you're wrong, then you might not survive. Investment bankers, for example, often they have to make decisions very quickly. You just don't have the time to activate your system 2 and think it through. That in daily life, that happens like a lot. Like when I got here at the airport, for example, I wanted to take the bus to the Montreal city center, and I saw that the bus was just getting there, so I was running from the terminal to the bus actually to catch it. But then I noticed that there's 2 buses going to downtown, one taking you actually to the city center, and the other one taking you to the subway stop. But I didn't have the time to actually think it through or actually get my phone and actually look it up. So I just jumped on the bus because it was leaving and then hoped for the best, right? That's an example. That's what's often happening in daily life. So boosting system 2, boosting people's reflective thinking, yes, definitely useful, but often a better strategy is actually to get around system 2 and actually target our system 1 and make sure that correct intuitions will be boosted, right? So that we don't need to activate system 2. So just saying that it's an important applied question, okay? So in the studies that I'm going to show you, what we did is we used the 2 response frame paradigm to see whether or not after the intervention, it's actually the system 2 responses that are being boosted or system 1, the intuitive response that's already more frequently correct after the intervention, right? Okay. So you get this, there's a pretest in which we're using 2 response paradigm intervention, and then a post-test in which we're also using a 2 response paradigm. And that will allow us to see at what level we're seeing most gain. Okay. All right. So typically they get different trials, different content. There's a control group and a training group. Training group gets to see the videos that I just showed you. The control group is just solving the problems without the videos and without the explanations. I'm going to show you the results of different studies using different problems. Study focuses on one different type of reasoning problem. But the results are pretty similar. So let's start by looking at the final responses. That's typically what has been tested in the past, and the work that Carrie Morwich did, that Mercier did. So they gave people sufficient time to actually think after the intervention. What you're seeing in the control group, not much is going on, but in the training group, you get a very big training effect. Okay, so that's nice. That's replicating Mercier, replicating Carrie Morwich's work. This is working the intervention. So after the intervention, if you give people the time to actually think it through, you see a big jump in accuracy. People do a better job. We're less biased after training. Right? But what's important here is that we're already seeing a big chunk of that improvement in the initial response stage after training. So yes, again, like if you give people the time to train, they're doing an even better job, right? There's like a 10% additional increase, but the biggest chunk of this improvement is already being observed in the initial response stage, suggesting that what the intervention is typically doing is targeting, boosting these correct intuitions after training. Okay. Well, that's important also to run like control studies. For example, what might be happening in the bat and ball problem, for example, maybe in the intervention, it could be the case that what you're doing is basically telling people that there's something wrong with their intuitions. So maybe you're just cueing a reversed intuitive heuristic, something that where people know, like, aha, so it's actually the response that I think is most likely is not correct. So I should just like pick the least likely response. So that could be like a very simple heuristic that could actually get you to the correct response. In the case of the bat and ball problem, people might just assume, well, aha, I see what I have to do here. You know, the correct response is always half of what I think it is. It's not 10 cents, it's 5 cents. That heuristic too would get you to the correct response. So to be sure that people are not using such a simple heuristic strategy, we also have the control problems, you know, the ones in which the intuitive response is also the correct response. This is a control version, for example, of the bat and ball problem. You just leave out the more damp part. So in this case, 10 cents, the intuitive response is also correct. And what you see here that if people were applying those types of general heuristics, then you should see that after the intervention, people should do very badly on these control problems, because in this case, the intuitive response is the correct response. And that's not what we're seeing. After the intervention, people stay at almost like 100% correct responses. Right? So it's not that they're simply switching to this simple heuristic after training. Also important, we're not seeing transfer. So if we're running a training study explaining a specific logical principle, people get better at applying that principle, but that does not generalize to principles that were not being trained in the task. So if you explain the bat and ball problem to participants, they'll do a better job solving the bat and ball problem, but they will not be impacted. For example, their performance on base rate neglect problems will not be impacted. So it's not the case that you're in general boosting the correctness of system 2. No, it's very specifically tied to the principle that you train people on. It's also robust because if we're retesting people after 2 months, we're still seeing that the training is persistent. Okay, so nice. Okay, conflict detection and the debiasing. Where does conflict detection gets to the picture here? Well, I showed you that we get some really nice results replicating previous work. Get a very nice accuracy boost after training. But after training, performance is not perfect. So some people remain biased even after training. Right? We get about like 60% of the sample of biased reasoners who show improvement, right? But about like 40% of people who were initially biased are not affected by the training. And the question is why? And our idea was that, no, maybe this is like linked, connected to this conflict detection process that I showed you. Like the fact that most biased reasoners seem to be sensitive to the presence of bias, the presence of conflict. Right? That's what I just showed you, right? These data. Okay. But what's important there, it's also been shown that there's like individual differences here. So often, like most biased reasoners will show this conflict sensitivity. So they seem to be realizing that their incorrect response they're generating is not fully warranted, but not all individuals are showing it. Okay. So basically now you can link those two. So maybe what's going on is that those people were not showing improvement after the intervention. Maybe it's specifically that group of people who did not show the conflict detection effect. Okay. And that's basically what we're going to test. So we're going to test conflict detection pre-intervention, right? We're going to see who improves, who does not improve after training, and then we're going to see whether or not that's linked to the conflict detection. And that's exactly what we're finding. So the group of people who actually remain biased, right? are exactly those people who showed the smallest or not even a significant conflict detection effect. The group of people, initially biased reasoner, who improved after practice, showed a much stronger conflict detection effect before intervention. Okay, conclusions. So what I show you here was that, okay, so we can train people, we can debias people. That's interesting applied implications. I want to just like focus on the theoretical implications. Just going to take 2 more minutes and then I'll take a little bit less questions. It's theoretically important because it tells us something about the functional role of conflict detection. Because in the end, like there's some discussion in the field. We all feel this is an important process, but in the end, like you could say, well, what's the value of this process? Because people might show this conflict detection effect, but they're still being biased, right? So the idea here is that it actually reflects this kind of like medium knowledge states where you have like some people who can actually solve problems like intuitively, even after reflection, who have all the knowledge needed to solve problems. Another group of people who do not have this basic knowledge, right? Simply do not know the logical principles that are needed to solve these problems. So even they will not show conflict detection. And if you explain them how to solve a problem in 5 minutes, that's not going to help them because they do not have the basic knowledge to build on. But we've got this group in between that actually show conflict detection effects, right? They're not generating a correct response without intervention, but at least they realize that the incorrect heuristic response that they're generating is not fully warranted. So presumably reflecting that already have this sort of like medium knowledge states in between where the dots are there, but they're simply not being connected yet, okay? It also tells us something about the nature of the typical bias that we're observing in these experiments, indicating if you can debias people like after like, you know, a 5-minute intervention by showing them a simple video, well, that is showing you that there had to be something there like from the start. Like it's not the intervention is going to build the necessary knowledge from scratch. That would be magic, right? In like 5 minutes, you can explain people how to solve an equation with 2 unknowns. No, it's presumably effective because what it's doing is just reactivating knowledge that's already there, just boosting the so-called logical intuition. Right? And that is I think like maybe some additional evidence for the idea that we might have these logical intuitions, even in untrained reasoners before the intervention. I'm going to take 1 minute because this is really important. Like the boundary conditions, this is working, but it's working because we're always focusing on very simple logical rules. Typically, all the classic reasoning problems that I showed you that involve base rate neglect, conjunction fallacy, the logic that you need to solve this is pretty basic. Typically something that you learn like sometimes elementary school, but definitely like secondary education. It's something that we've all been taught during our high school education. Right? And that's important because according to me, like the reason that people have these logical intuitions, it's simply the result of an automatization process. You've been exposed to these principles. Yes, you might not like solve the problems correctly, right? But it's easy actually to get you to apply them because you already acquired this information. Fraction base rate neglect, for example, it's something that you typically did in elementary school. So the key principle has been taught. People know this. Right? And that's why it's working. So it's no magic. It's just building on prior knowledge. And it also means there's no free lunch, right? It's not like, oh, no, it only takes like 5 minutes to debias people. Well, it only takes 5 minutes to debias people because the hard work was already done during the educational stage where you actually mastered these principles. You did some exercises on fractions, etc. Okay? That's where the hard work was done. Yes, afterwards you can reactivate these principles, but that wouldn't work if, for example, you were to solve, I don't know, nuclear physics equations, something that you've never been exposed to. So that's definitely an important boundary condition to stress. And it also points to the role of education. One of the things that we're doing is, for example, with Debiased, former PhD, now postdoc at Gort's lab, for example. We're testing this, for example, with the Himba in Namibia, indigenous tribe over there, where adults have not been exposed to formal maths schooling, for example, where you can find these. I mean, Esther got to she got these people to improve a little bit, but we're not seeing the results that we're seeing with adults in the West, for example. Right? Why? Because people have not been exposed to these principles yet. So less exposure, less debiasing. And we see the same thing with younger kids. We run these studies, these debiasing studies with 7th graders, and what you're seeing is you're not boosting their performance, right? Why? Because they haven't been exposed to the necessary knowledge yet. So there's nothing to build on. You first have to be exposed to the key principles, have to learn them. Afterwards, it's then really easy to boost the activation of those principles. But if the principles have not been acquired yet, no training effect. Okay. Okay, if you're interested in these interventions, as I showed you, we have this free training tool where you can actually test your performance. You can watch the videos and see how you do on different tasks. That's it. I'm just going to thank my team, postdocs and PhD students, and that's it. I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry, I took a bit longer, but I wanted to definitely present the boundary conditions too. Take some coffee. I don't know. I'll just keep it for after. Yeah. Yeah. Gord, shoot. Yeah.
You mentioned the boundary conditions on it, like a simple logical problems. Another thing that occurred to me is like not just the debiasing stuff, but the other stuff that the sort of problems that you're using are problems where you only really need to reason once to sort like that is there's a fundamental imbalance in terms of why we have so many intuitive, accurate answers. And like reasoning doesn't like correct all that often. It only needs to correct once. And then once you've sorted the problem, you have it sorted out and you can answer it away. Have you done anything on like things where you have to reason every time, like argument evaluation or something like that, where there's no way to
Yeah. So with these problems, it's you could just basically apply some strategy and proceed. Once you know the principle, you just can keep on applying it. So it's not that hard. We also did it with like problems where every problem actually has a unique solution, such as the compound remotes associated like inside problems. And in that case, you get the same effect. It's less prevalent though. Like, so there's still like, you know, out of the top of my head, you get like 30% of the correct responses that are being generated that are generated intuitively. The phenomena is still there, but less prevalent. Definitely sure. Same thing with, for example, the Moses illusion, like semantic illusions, where every problem is also really unique. The exact same, it's still there, but not as frequent as in the reasoning tasks. Yeah. Yeah.
In the hypothesis that you have made, such that you have created this concept of logical intuitions to promote the parallelisms that exist between logic and intuition, the system one. So it implies such that there's logic at the same time that there are intuitions, but from what we have heard, and maybe in much more frontal baggage, logic and intuition are holding completely dichotomical concepts. One cannot be referred as such, but there what is implied is that both can be at the same time, and what may provide for such that logic and intuition may not have the boundaries that we have thought to have, and maybe much closer, and therefore there's a much more profound reflection period, for example, like system 2 that can be defined by logic now, because system 1 has a lot of logic ourselves as well. So how do we promote now the terms of logic and intuitions when they are not?
I should stress like the label logical intuition is just a label, right? Like from the start, like Gord, for example, said it was like a really bad label. And that might actually be true. So the only thing it's referring to is that people showed us at the descriptive level sensitivity to the typically logical normative norm that's implied in those problems. It is not saying that people are going through the exact same computation than they would when they're actually doing real logical thinking. It can't be the case because they don't have the time. and the resources to do it. So they must be doing something differently. What is exactly different between the two? It's something that it's ongoing discussion. Right? So what we're showing is at the empirical level, they seem to show that sensitivity to at least like this knowledge. It seems to be there, like it's being activated at an intuitive level. But then exactly what is it that they're doing? Like, is it like classic logic? By definition, no, because then you would need more time and more resources to actually think it through. Yeah. I'll just let you do the. Yeah. Sorry. We can talk about it after.
Yeah, I can. I'll leave like this to the students in their time.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if this is a comment or a question. So the bat and ball test to me seems to be the most biased test in of itself, because to resolve it, it requires mathematical skill. So the person who has greater mathematical skill is most likely to resolve it the fastest. However, in an interesting way, it is also the one that will reveal the most intuitively structure of the bias, because the person that is biased, what they're doing on a computational level is they're taking the sum, they're subtracting, they're taking the total, they're subtracting the sum that you're giving them, and then so it's revealing on two levels, which is really interesting if you want to analyze that test. The second question that I have is, when you offer training, what is the carryover time-wise of that training in real life, like 3 months henceforth, 6 months henceforth? So I don't know if those are comments or questions, but.
Like that, easily reply to the second part of that. Like, so we tested it like after 2 months. And that's all what we did. Like, and it's still there. Like after 2 months, yes, the accuracy decreases a little bit, but they're still above like what they were like pre-intervention. So the effect is still there after 2 months. Will it still be there like after a year, like 2 years? Like, I don't know. Like, we haven't tested it. But even in that case, and also the fact that there's no transfer. So actually, initially, like when we tried to publish these findings, like we had a hard time getting them published because we were not showing transfer. And if you're talking like applied people or in education, like everybody wants to see transfer. Otherwise, your intervention is not like solid. It's like the holy grail of like training studies, and nobody actually ever finds it. There are lots of studies showing like if you train people on a specific task, yes, they'll get better at that specific task, but there's no transfer. And in this case, actually, I don't care if there's transfer. There shouldn't be any transfer, because if this is real, if you're activating pre-existing knowledge, it's making sense that what will be activated is that knowledge that you specifically focused on, but a principle that it's not being mentioned, of course, it's not going to be activated. To me, that would be like magic. I mean, if you could boost like the correct activations, if you're doing the training, yeah. So there's no transfer. To me, that's not like, and even at an applied level, like because these interventions are so short, they only take 5 seconds. So why not do what we did, like what we tried to do, we started doing on the website that I showed you. We could just like let's say like the 100 most common biases that people show like in daily life, and we just have people go through them like maybe every 2 months or something. So in that case, it's not a limitation. Theoretically, it's making sense that there's no transfer. Even at the applied level, like I don't think it's an issue. So different opinions out there. Sure. Yeah.
Is through
Well, that's already the idea behind, like the whole idea is that that's exactly what's going on. Even like without training, people who spontaneously solve these problems correctly, that's the whole idea. That initially, the first time that they saw this, they presumably also have to use their system too. It's true. But if you do it like a couple of times, after a lot of exercise, you'll automatize the applications of the principles that you need to solve the problem. So you get this transfer from system 2 to system 1.
By, harder by
Yeah, simply because they're like, you haven't been exposed to like the core principle yet. Like if you haven't seen the problem, the necessary knowledge is simply not there, then just there's nothing to reactivate basically, right?
look. It's the process of continuously pressing reflective thinking into intuitive thinking itself is heuristic.
I think it will be harder to get to. I think like there's research showing, and it's something that we did study, for example, with these problems. If during the intervention, so when people are watching the video, right? Esther Boissin, it's actually the postdoc now, actually ran these studies. One of the studies that she did was actually putting people under loads while they were watching the video, right? And what you see that in that case is that the intervention is less efficient. So when people are watching the video, they do need to think it through, right? So you do need to activate their system 2. It's helping you at that point. But once you did, then afterwards, it's really easy to apply these principles like automatically.
I mean, if they don't use this specific, they don't see this specific problem, they don't have to use this.
Is it possible to get to like automatization without reflection? Like I'd say like I could see that being really hard, but it could be like it's something that we've never tested. But in general, I'd say what we did test was clearly showing that there's a benefit to reflecting during the automatization process.
Once something gets the automation process, can I be de-automatized if they don't use it for two?
Yeah. Yeah, that's like any training, right? Look at sports, for example. If you do something a lot, like it will be automatic. But then if you haven't played, I don't know, like if you haven't been like shooting hoops for like 20 years, then you're going to lose your skill. Yeah. Oh, Valerie?
So just following up on this question, because the link it makes for me is to the literature on expertise and how people acquire expertise. You know, the normal path to expertise in a technical skill like bridge or whatever.
Yep.
Is like 10,000 hours of deliberate practice.
Yeah.
So now clearly these are much simpler skills, but I think the principle, it might be helpful to think about the principle in the same way, that it is deliberate practice that leads to
Yeah.
beyond.
Definitely. Like if you look at like what we're doing, like elementary school, even high school, like, you know, even mastering fractions, look at all the time that we're investing during education to just like teaching fractions. So yeah, for sure.
The people who can have good detection of conflict use a basic knowledge or supply for everyone.
So the people who show the conflict detection effect, do they need some specific knowledge? That's what.
Basics, but
Well, they would need the exact same knowledge, like they wouldn't have to be, if they were not being exposed like to these logical principles during education, for example, then they would not show the effect. That's basically what we're seeing with the Himba in Namibia, or with like really young kids at the start of like secondary education. 7th graders, they will not show these debiasing effects. When you're testing them with these types of tasks that are typically, for example, the bat and ball, solving an equation with 2 unknowns, it's something that you typically learn during the high school years. So, yes.
Julia wonders if some of the bias might be explained by explicitly incorporating pragmatics. She doesn't think it would totally change the big picture, but she wonders if it is a piece missing from the model that would bring our explanation for the mental processes more in line with the observed behavior.
Pragmatics definitely matter, like, right? The way that you're going to interpret the task, that will affect your performance. And there's a big old debate in the field whether everything can be explained by pragmatics, right? I don't think so, because that's exactly what these studies are showing, that the fact that people show this conflict sensitivity suggests that if it were the case that they were just like completely misinterpreting the task, they were just like using a different standard to evaluate the task, then they shouldn't show conflict detection. Like if you were to interpret this as you would typically do in daily life, not taking logical principles into account, then you shouldn't see the conflict detection effect. So yes, pragmatics definitely matter, but they cannot explain the fact that the people show the sensitivity to this logical principle in these studies. Yeah.
You have time, I can do a second, but
Yes,
Last question.
last question.
I'll do last question for everybody. So as you know, one of the like main criticisms or the thing that you can't convince Shane Frederick of is that like you're really shutting down system 2 for the initial responses in the two response paradigm. And I mean, I think it's very obvious that for sure it's less. And so whether it's none at all is maybe more of an academic dispute that doesn't matter. But I have a question for you, and I actually thought about this for a long time, and I've never asked this. You use visual working memory for those. Have you ever tried anything? Because it's not really actually visual working memory that's being used for the task.
Yeah.
Have you tried more substantive ones? And maybe not because people can't read the problem. Like they can't, but
No, actually, I tried a lot of things when I was doing my PhD. There's like also like tapping tasks where people have to tap like a complex pattern, just a verbal load, using like numbers, for example. In all those cases, similar results. Not saying that like the modality will not have an impact. I'm not going to get into that working memory debate, but definitely you also find it with different types of loads. Whether or not that's sufficient, well, as you know, like, and that's actually something as a field, I think we should address. So what are we defining as like deliberation and intuition? At what point do we all agree? Well, most of us agree that, okay, we can classify this as an intuitive process. Because right now, like the criticism that we're getting, for example, is, well, you know, maybe in like 5 seconds, like, you know, they can still do it. But where are we coming from? It's like from studies saying, well, you need like a minute to actually think it through to get to the correct response to like 5 seconds. That's no longer like what we meant like back in the days with deliberation, right? So to everyone who's saying like, well, maybe this is not pure intuition, I agree, but then you would at least need to redefine what you think that system 2, what deliberation is really about. If you can do it in 5 seconds, even if the visual task is not as demanding, while you're still doing that, I think like we really need to rethink what we mean by deliberation. And I think the implication of that would be actually worse than accepting that the intuitive system can do certain things. But it's definitely, it's going to be like an important discussion for the field. Because obviously like we don't have like how much load is intuitive, how much time is intuitive. And at least if we would get something that most of us would agree on, like, yeah, like up until that point, we'll define it or we'll classify it as intuitive, would be very helpful, like for me, but I think like for the whole field.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.